Hey there, it's Erica, and today I'm going to share 5 parchment paper substitutes for baking, plus 2 that you definitely want to avoid. Let's dive in. The first substitute for parchment paper is aluminum foil. This is great to use when you want to lift whatever you're baking right out of the pan. It's great for lining a baking sheet when you're cooking bacon, toasting nuts, etc. But keep in mind that aluminum foil is not non-stick like parchment paper is. Parchment paper is coated in silicone, which gives it its non-stick properties. So make sure to oil or butter the aluminum foil if you're concerned about the food sticking to it. Also keep in mind that since aluminum foil is reflective, it can alter the baking time. It also tends to make whatever you're baking crisper or darker on the bottom versus using parchment paper. The second substitute for parchment paper is a silicone baking mat, also known as a Silpat mat. These are made from a fiberglass core and a food-safe silicone outer layer. If you treat them properly, they can last through up to 3,000 bakes. These are really non-stick and they're great for baking cookies, scones, etc. However, they're not meant to be used as a cutting surface, so you must remove whatever you baked to a separate surface if it needs to be sliced. Also, you can't cut it down to size to fit your pan, but they are pretty much infinitely reusable. The next substitute for parchment paper is silicone baking pans. You can actually purchase silicone muffin liners, muffin tins, and baking pans. They're non-stick, so you don't have to line them with muffin papers or parchment paper like traditional baking pans. The downside is silicone is obviously not as sturdy as glass or metal, so you have to be more careful when you're transferring your baked goods to the oven. The fourth substance for parchment paper is cooking spray. There are many different cooking sprays on the market, and some of them actually contain flour to help with the non-stick properties. I personally try to avoid the propellants and other additives contained in many of these cooking sprays. I like the Chosen Foods or Thrive Market avocado oil sprays. You could also just grease your pan manually with oil or butter. These are great options if you need just a little extra non-stick boost. But if you need to ensure that your cake will absolutely not stick to the pan, then you need to use this last substitute, which is grease plus flour. This method of greasing your pan involves first rubbing it all over with a solid fat such as butter or coconut oil. Then you sprinkle the pan with flour, and then turn the pan in every direction so the flour evenly coats the grease. Then you tap out any excess flour. And there you have a pan that's perfectly coated in butter and flour. This method isn't quite as foolproof as parchment paper, but if you're careful to cover every single surface of the pan, it comes close. The downside of this method is the outside of whatever you're baking gets coated in flour, which may be a drawback for you aesthetically. You also run the risk of burning the flour on the outside if you're using a really hot oven. Okay, those are 5 substitutes for parchment paper for baking. Let's address a couple of substitutes that you should never use when baking. The first substitute you should never use is a wax paper. Wax paper is not designed for baking with. The wax that coats the paper can actually melt off into the food when you're baking. And considering that it's often coated in paraffin wax, you really don't want that melting off into your food. So stick to using wax paper for storing food and keep it away from your oven. The other substitute that you should never use for baking is paper grocery bags. They're not a good substitute for parchment paper because they're not manufactured with baking in mind. The inks used to print the paper bags could leach into your food when cooking. If you want to store your cooled food in a really clean brown paper grocery bag, then feel free. Just don't use it for baking. Alright, if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and make sure to check out my how-to playlist for more helpful kitchen tips and tricks. For lining a baking sheet, which gives it could link brown paper grocery bag